This morning, at approximately 8:47 a.m. Eastern Time, federal law enforcement activity reportedly began at a high-profile private property in Florida, following the issuance of a court-authorized writ of execution connected to unpaid civil judgments. According to reports, multiple federal officers, licensed valuation experts, and local law enforcement support were present to initiate the initial phase of asset documentation and valuation tied to enforcement of large-scale civil financial orders. Before assuming political motivation or extraordinary legal treatment, it is critical to understand what a writ of execution actually means within the American civil court system. A writ of execution is not unusual. It is a standard legal enforcement tool. It is issued only after 4 conditions are met: a civil case is decided, a monetary judgment is entered, appeals are exhausted or limited, and payment is not made. Once these conditions exist, courts are legally permitted to authorize creditors to pursue asset seizure to satisfy the debt. This represents the final stage of civil enforcement, not an extraordinary action. Now let's talk about timeline structure in cases of this magnitude. Large civil judgments rarely move quickly at the beginning. The process typically includes judgment entry, appeal filings, bond disputes, asset discovery, and finally enforcement authorization. In some cases, if appeal bonds are not properly posted, courts may allow enforcement to begin even while appeals remain pending, depending on judicial rulings. Next, consider judgment interest pressure. Large monetary judgments often accumulate statutory interest daily. This means delays increase the total amount owed. Once enforcement begins, creditors usually target liquid assets first, because converting liquid assets stops interest growth faster than waiting on long-term liquidation. Now let's discuss asset discovery. Before any seizure occurs, creditors typically conduct extensive financial discovery. This includes bank accounts, property records, business ownership structures, revenue streams, and licensing income. Collection strategy is based on liquidity priority, cash accounts first, recurring income second, and real estate last, because property liquidation takes time. Property protection rules are often misunderstood. Some states provide homestead exemptions for primary residences, but courts analyze how a property is legally classified and used. If a property operates primarily as a commercial enterprise, homestead protections may not apply. Courts examine zoning, licensing, revenue activity, and ownership structure through legal hearings, not assumptions. During the initial enforcement entry, law enforcement does not immediately remove assets. The focus is documentation. Assets are photographed, cataloged, and secured for valuation. Courts require detailed valuation records before authorizing any sale. Professional appraisers then conduct formal evaluations. They assess condition, provenance, comparable auction results, market demand, and resale value. Court-supervised auctions require fair market valuation evidence, not estimates. Assets typically subject to seizure in commercially classified properties may include business equipment, fixtures, furniture, displayed artwork, vehicles tied to business use, inventory, and operational revenue accounts. Personal living areas and private property usually require additional court approval, because courts separate business assets from personal property. Real estate seizure is generally the longest phase. It requires further hearings, lien verification, mortgage priority analysis, and forced sale authorization. One property alone rarely satisfies very large judgments, which is why creditors often pursue multiple assets simultaneously. At this enforcement stage, defense strategy is limited. The judgment itself cannot be relitigated. Legal challenges usually focus on enforcement scope, asset classification, or valuation disputes, not liability. Physical enforcement often triggers settlement discussions. Once asset cataloging becomes visible, defendants frequently shift toward negotiation, because forced auctions typically generate lower value than voluntary liquidation. High-visibility enforcement actions also influence broader legal behavior. Courts become less tolerant of delay tactics. Creditors act more aggressively. Defendants negotiate earlier. Historically, large civil judgments take years to fully resolve. But once enforcement begins, collection usually starts with asset mapping and liquidity targeting. Public perception often focuses on dramatic moments. Legally, enforcement is procedural. Most collections occur quietly through financial transfers rather than public seizures. The typical next phase includes appraisal reports submitted to the court, creditor motions for sale authorization, court approval of auction structures, engagement of auction firms, and scheduled sale dates. Proceeds are then applied to the judgment balance. Legal analysts watch for appraisal totals, enforcement motions, settlement signals, and additional seizure filings. Civil enforcement is slow, but once activated, it is persistent. Civil courts cannot imprison defendants, but they can dismantle asset structures to satisfy judgments. Historically, this is how major civil accountability cases conclude. Once enforcement begins, momentum usually moves in one direction, toward collection. Not quickly, not smoothly, but steadily. Within 24 to 72 hours after initial cataloging, appraisers prepare court-grade valuation reports, verifying authenticity, ownership chains, serial numbers, insurance records, and comparable auction sales. Valuation disputes in high-value cases can last months. Court-approved auction firms are selected through judicial authorization. These firms specialize in high-value distressed assets and market globally to maximize recovery. The real pressure point is not the arrival of officers, it is the announcement of auction dates. Once sales are scheduled, asset loss becomes irreversible. This is when last-minute settlements often intensify. Defendants may file emergency motions to delay sales or dispute valuations, but courts typically limit delays once judgments are final. Settlement negotiations at this stage become mathematical, not emotional. Creditors decide between guaranteed structured payments and extended liquidation risk. If settlement succeeds, courts may pause auctions and establish payment monitoring. Missed payments reactivate enforcement automatically. If negotiations fail, auctions proceed, revenue redirection expands, and real estate liquidation hearings begin. These cases may last years, but recovery usually continues. Mortgage lenders and tax authorities are paid first in real estate sales, which is why creditors pursue multiple assets at once. Even after settlements, courts often maintain long-term monitoring. Financial flexibility typically shrinks, lending becomes harder, and transactions face scrutiny. Historically, large enforcement cases reshape lending, insurance, and compliance behavior across industries. They also become legal case studies focused on enforcement mechanics, not personalities. Once liquidation begins, cases rarely reverse. They conclude through structured payment, partial liquidation, or long-term asset conversion. Civil courts are not designed for punishment, they are designed for recovery. At this stage, the only remaining question is how payment occurs, not whether it will. The system moves slowly, but persistently, and once enforcement starts, it usually continues until judgments are paid, settled, or legally discharged.